Welcome, bienvenue, bonjour, to the 40th Democracy Forum at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm Martin Regg Cohn, host of the TMU Democracy Forum. Before we get started, a reminder that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. That's the Treaty of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, and we acknowledge this land today. Before I tell you about today's guest, a quick word about me. I write a political column for the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest and best daily newspaper. It's mostly about Ontario politics. I'm also a senior fellow at the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, which sponsors the Democracy Forum, which is a nonpartisan undertaking. Now, today we're only 16 days away from voting day on February 27th, which is why we've invited the major party leaders to talk about Ontario's election campaign. Now, Doug Ford, the progressive conservative leader who wants to be re-elected as premier, has declined. He doesn't want to do a Democracy Forum in the middle of an election campaign. But the good news is that all the other major opposition leaders, party leaders, I should say, there's no opposition and premier in a campaign, so that always slips out for me. But the other major party leaders are all in. And last week we had NDP leader Marit Stiles, Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, and today we have the leader of the Ontario Green Party, Mike Schreiner. So let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Schreiner. He won the leadership of the Green Party in 2009. And 9 years later, nine's his lucky number, he won a seat in the Ontario legislature for the riding of Guelph. He had a life before politics, running his own local food company. He was born in Kansas and has an MA in history from Indiana University and degrees in history and business administration from the University of Kansas. Now, this is his fourth appearance at the Democracy Forum, so welcome back, Mr. Schreiner.
Hey, Martin, it's a pleasure to join you, and I just want to thank TMU for hosting the Democracy Forum.
So I'm going to kick it off with the questions to get us rolling. Then we'll open it up to the audience later, so start thinking up your own questions. You can use the Q&A function on Zoom. If you are watching through Zoom, if you're on YouTube, you can just listen and include your name if you want me to give you a shout out. I like to remind people that this is not a news conference or a confrontation. It's a democracy forum where we try to dig a little deeper to get more in-depth answers from our guests. And Mike, it's an election, so people are really looking for answers. So let's dive in. For the record, Mike, you hold the record for our most frequent guest on the Democracy Forum. We do not neglect the Green Party. This is appearance number 4. That makes you very democratic. So thanks. And in fact, you'll recall that I think you're the only surviving leader who was a guest at our very first Democracy Forum before the 2018 election, when we had all the major party leaders, including the premier of the day, talking about democratic engagement. But your most recent appearance was just before the 2022 election, just 3.5 years ago. And you'll remember that the topic of that event was, who can defeat Doug Ford? And that's an important question that's on the minds of a lot of voters, not policy or personalities, but who can defeat Doug Ford? Who can get it done, as Mr. Premier would say? He's not the premier right now. He's the caretaker. So my question to you is, all these years later, the other opposition leaders, the other party leaders of the NDP and Liberals, they're gone. They were wrong because they said they could defeat Doug Ford. So tell us today, who can defeat Doug Ford?
The voters of Ontario can defeat Doug Ford, and they'll have the opportunity to make that decision on February 27th and in the days ahead of time if they want to do advance voting. I would say from a party standpoint, I think all three opposition parties have strengths in different parts of the province that will put pressure on the Ford government. And I would say when it comes to the Ontario Greens, our strength lies in a number of rural ridings that feel abandoned by the Ford government because of the premier and caretaker mode's focus on wasting money on things in Toronto that people in Toronto don't even want. $2.2 billion for the mega spa, $40 million ripping up bike lanes, tens of billions of dollars with this ridiculous idea of tunneling under the 401, building Highway 413. We have a perfectly good highway right next to it. And people in rural ridings like Parry Sound, Muskoka, Wellington, Halton Hills, Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, Dufferin, Caledon, we're running strong local candidates are saying, how come the premier's not spending money on keeping our roads and bridges fixed? How come the premier is not spending money on affordable housing in our riding? What about healthcare? Emergency departments are being closed in rural communities. Students are learning in overcrowded classrooms. Those voters are saying we're tired of conservatives taking us for granted, and we're looking for other options like the Green Party.
So that's a really good overview. Not surprising because you're in campaign form, and that's great. That is democracy. But I'm not going to let you off the hook because, in a way, you're best placed to give us a little more objective response to that question because I don't think you're running to be premier. You're, I think, too candid about that. You're running to win as many seats as you can. So tell us, you're right. The voters can do it. Which party leader would you say, or which party do you think is best placed to defeat Doug Ford?
I think it'll be a combination of all three of the opposition parties. I mean, obviously, the NDP it has strengths in certain parts of the province, and I look at places like Windsor, London, Niagara, and the GTA. Liberals have strengths in certain parts of the province, looking at Ottawa and the GTA, and Greens have strengths in certain parts of the province, Guelph, Kitchener, and a number of rural ridings. And I think it can be a combination of how the votes break down in a number of those ridings. And, we could be looking at the possibility of a minority government. And then that's going to create a whole host of other conversations. But at the end of the day, it's going to be how effective I am as the Ontario Green leader and the local candidates we have who are running good campaigns in those are. And I would say the same for the other parties and the other opposition leaders.
Okay, you've opened up a quick opening for me that a question I asked you last time and that I asked the other leaders last week. I think I know the answer, but let's just get you on the record. If there is a minority government, if your hope, I won't say it's a prediction, comes true, you would work with the other parties and you would presumably not prop up Doug Ford's Tories if you somehow held the balance of power. Not impossible because it happened in British Columbia. Your answer?
Yeah, I mean, the Greens in British Columbia have held the balance of power after two elections now, along with the NDP in British Columbia. So it's certainly, a possibility. That's obviously voters are going to make that decision. Greens have always had a history of willingly working across party lines to get things done for people. We would continue that. I think it would be very challenging for us to think of working in coalition with a Ford government, given the fact that he's dismantled all the climate programs in Ontario, the $8.3 billion Greenbelt scandal, the attack on Ontario farmland, Highway 413, paving over 400 acres of Greenbelt, 2,000 acres of prime farmland. I think there's a whole host of issues that would be very challenging for us to agree with the Conservatives on, but we're certainly open to working across party lines with the other opposition parties if that's the kind of government the people of Ontario choose.
Can I get a little more precision from you? Is it possible that you would prop up the Ford government, or that's not a possibility and you'd be happy to work with the others? Let's just be clear.
I think it's highly unlikely that I would work with the Ford government, given the government's record. I can see where we could find commonalities with the other two opposition parties.
Okay. I wanted to circle back to the premise of that question, and that is, it's looking as if Ford might be unbeatable in this election. I'm not one for predictions, so I'd never make that. But he is it's kind of a weird, almost unprecedented, not entirely unprecedented if you go back to 1990 election, but that's a really big gap he has, about 45% in most polls early on. It might be slipping. He needs to have a lot of slippage to get into a minority situation. And the Liberals are somewhere in the mid, low, high 20s, and the New Democrats low 20s or below 20s, and the Greens in their usual zone of anywhere from 5, 6, 7%. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. So is there any hope to defeat Doug Ford?
Well, Martin, I mean, first of all, you referred to, believe the 1990 election when it looked like the Liberal premier of the day was going to cakewalk to a majority government, and it led to the only NDP government we've had in Ontario. So a lot can change in the next 16 days. There's still two leaders debates to happen, one on Friday in Northern Ontario and one on Family Day at the CBC studios in Toronto. So let's see what happens coming out of that. I also think you have to look at riding by riding results as well. So sometimes you can have a commanding lead in the provincial wide vote, but that may not translate at the riding level. And like, for example, Greens were targeting a number of ridings like Parry Sound, Muskoka, for example, which we almost
Yeah.
won in the last election. We're in a very tight two-way race with the Conservatives in that riding. We're looking at Wellington, Halton Hills. No incumbent this time. We've had strong history in that riding as well. Have a local councillor running. Same thing in Bruce Grey Owen Sound. And so, we'll see when those riding by riding breakdowns come in. But a lot can happen, as you know, in politics in 16 days. And you look at the volatility that's happening south of the border, and that could shake up the election as well in the next 2 weeks.
I was going to ask you what your path to victory was in those ridings, but you beat me to it. I don't even have to ask the questions. You're fast, quick off the mark on that one. So thank you for sharing that on those ridings where you do have serious prospects, and you could go from a party of one to a party of two, which you're already at, and perhaps triple your representation. So let's just zoom out a little bit. Doug Ford triggered this early election by publicly declaring that he needed a strong mandate to stare down Donald Trump. Not really working so far. Today he's in Washington. I'm not sure why, but let's talk about America a little bit. Not everyone knows that you are American born and raised. You're not the only party leader with American roots, because I realized the other day that Mart Stiles, we think of her as a Newfoundlander who came to Ontario, but her parents are both American. So she is also of American descent. It's interesting. It just reminds us that we are so interconnected. Doug Ford spent much of his working life in Chicago. Why did you immigrate to Canada? Um, what's the difference between American and Canadian politics other than big money over there? We could spend a whole hour on that, but just in a quick soundbite, as you might say, why'd you come here and what's the diff?
Yeah, I came here for love. Followed my wife here and fell in love with Ontario and have never had a desire to go back. Raised two daughters here, who one's graduated from university, the other's in university. I've started a couple of businesses, nonprofit organizations, and now, leading a political party in Ontario. And I think
Tell us about the difference between the two political systems from what you've seen.
yeah, that's what I was just getting ready to say. I think the biggest difference is that obviously a parliamentary style of government versus a presidential style is very different. And I much prefer a parliamentary system over what the US has, because there's just so much gridlock that prevents government from acting in the US. And I think that's one of the reasons people are so frustrated in the United States, and what's partially to explain the election of such a disruptor like Donald Trump.
Let me sharpen the question. Forgive me to try to get your views. I'm really interested in the difference in political culture and also just how you're feeling. I'm not putting you on the spot. You don't have to be an apologist for America. You are our fellow Canadian citizen, but you do have an extra perspective coming from the Midwest as well. So when people ask you at the door if they know, how do you explain to Canadians who are feeling increasingly anti-American, understandably, you're kind of caught in the middle a little bit.
Not really. I'm pretty upset with the United
I'm not
States
accusing
right
you.
now.
I'm not playing the canard of dual loyalty. I'm just saying you have extra perspective, I guess, is what I should have said.
Yeah, I think obviously politics in Canada is much more progressive than in the United States. And I think populist politics is different in Canada than it is in the United States. Populist politics in the United States is very individual oriented, whereas populist politics in Canada is much more community oriented. And, somebody who grew up on the prairies, I always sort of contrasted prairie populism in the US with Tommy Douglas style prairie populism in Canada. And the biggest difference is, are you going to fight for the community or are you going to fight for the individual? And I like the fact that in Canada, we fight for our communities.
Interesting. And because, populism is shorthand now for Trumpism, and so it's become a dirty word, but you're quite right. Tommy Douglas, I often remind people, a populist, and I'm not going to try to flatter you or the opposite, but I think of you and your style as very much trying to have a populist impact on people, albeit in a more collective impulse rather than individual. So I'm struck by how little awareness there seems to be in the US about the attack on Canada. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah. I've reached out to some of the folks, I went to high school with a long time ago to just say like, hey, do you realize what you're doing to us? And also, do you realize how it's affecting you? And because I grew up in farm country, Martin, there's much higher awareness among farmers in the US of the negative impacts of Trump's trade war because it is going to negatively impact the food and farming sector in the US. So I think people in places like where I grew up are much more aware of it. My wife grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Little less so for folks in those areas because I think there's more of a manufacturing base there, and people are saying like, "Hey, we want to bring back manufacturing jobs." But what they don't realize is, especially when it comes to the auto sector, we're so integrated that as Trump attacks Canada, he's actually attacking Americans as well. And so I think
Yeah, but your point about, sorry to interrupt, but your point about the in pockets of the U.S. where they who are in the line of fire, they're aware. But beyond that, other than the business press and farmers, or particularly the auto sector, it's strange. Okay, we didn't bring you on to be an America expert, but I couldn't resist just picking your brain a little bit. Let's stay a little bit on the American theme, but from an Ontario politics point of view. Just give us your quick take on Mr. Ford goes to Washington. He's there today. Uh, what's it like for when a provincial premier on the campaign trail goes to the center of the superpower? Is he getting any FaceTime? Is there any impact? Is there any point to this?
well, it doesn't seem like the premier's had an opportunity to meet directly with President Trump. And I would argue that the trip today just highlights why we should not be having a provincial election right now. It is so irresponsible for the premier to call an election when we're facing this tariff threat. I've been saying we need to be working across party lines, jurisdictional and sectoral lines to show strength through unity to push back against Trump. I think it's very selfish of the premier to play politics with tariffs when so many people's jobs are on the line and when we should be working together to show strength through unity.
So let's talk for a second about the hot mic moment that he had last week. I think it kind of removed any pretense that this election was really about Donald Trump. So without belaboring that point, my question to you is, what is this election really about? What should it be about?
Well, I would say the election for Doug Ford is about how do I get ahead of the $8.3 billion Greenbelt scandal that's being investigated by the RCMP? How do I get ahead of a federal election? Because so many people are blaming Justin Trudeau for their problems when it's actually Doug Ford's jurisdiction. And this gets to me what the election should be about. People tell me the housing crisis is their number one issue because it's driving the affordability crisis. That's provincial jurisdiction. It's worse in Ontario than it is in any other province. Doug Ford has failed to fix it. Secondly, people tell me our healthcare system is collapsing. Well, that's provincial jurisdiction. Doug Ford's underinvestment in our healthcare system has led to record numbers of people not having a family doctor, closures of emergency departments. Then people tell me, oh, I'm sick and tired of my kids being in overcrowded classrooms. Again, that's provincial jurisdiction. Doug Ford's $1,500 per student cut to our education system. And then the final one is the attack on farmland. We're losing 319 acres of farmland every day. Ford's efforts to open the Greenbelt for development, his mandatory urban boundary expansions onto farmland, his building of Highway 413 on farmland. Martin, if there was ever a time we should be protecting farmland and our food security and our food self-sufficiency, it's now when we're in a potential trade war with the U.S. That's why we are really focusing on saying we have to build homes we can afford in the communities we know and love without paving over our farmland because we have to protect our $50 billion food and farming economy and our food security. Unfortunately, Ford's been effective. He's been effective up until now of blaming all those problems on Justin Trudeau. But Justin Trudeau is not going to be there much longer, and I think the premier needs to be held accountable.
So you got a lot of lists on this campaign trail. That was a long list. Let me just ask you if there was political professionals, political scientists, people who are political junkies often will say, what's the ballot question going to be? That's just fancy talk for what's going to be top of mind when people are in the voting booth and cast their ballots. What's the number one issue?
The number one issue is housing affordability. Housing starts are at an all-time low in Ontario. Housing prices are at an all-time high. There is no city in Ontario where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford even average monthly rent. 81,000 people experiencing homelessness. When I talk to people about the anger, especially young people, they say, I don't know if I'll ever own a home and I can barely pay the rent. This is not fair. And so that's why on the very first day, our very first announcement was a first-time homebuyers plan that would take the fees and taxes off of starter homes built within existing urban boundaries. So we're not talking about paving over farmland. We would remove development charges and land transfer taxes, saving first-time home buyers up to $150,000. That's the kind of bold policy we need to unlock housing affordability in this province.
Okay. So that's what I hear from politicians as well. It's what I hear from a lot of people, affordability, housing. I guess the number one issue top of mind for you or for voters is not the environment and climate change. I brought my green tea mug, masala chai, which I brewed just for you in this mug. I'd offer you some. I have in our bureau when you come to drop by in the past. But why is the environment or climate change and the fight against global warming not top of mind for you at least, or your supporters? Maybe it is.
So I would say, first of all, the housing crisis is intimately connected to the climate crisis. The number one driver of climate pollution in Ontario is transportation emissions. The number one driver of transportation emissions is low density sprawl development. That's also what's leading to the housing crisis we're facing. So if we can fix the housing crisis by building homes that people can afford in the communities they know and love without paving over our farmlands, our wetlands, our green belt, and our green spaces, which, by the way, are vitally important to protecting us from climate-fueled unsafe weather events, we can lower transportation emissions. So the two are intimately connected. I would say in the minds of most voters, though, it's getting through the end of the month, paying the rent, paying the mortgage. That's why we're talking about housing affordability. That's why we're talking about protections for renters. That's why we're talking about having government get back into building nonprofit and co-op housing so people having a safe, affordable home to live in tonight, and it's directly connected to climate.
Okay. I want to drill down on something you mentioned about transportation and pollution. And just remind people, if you are watching on the webinar, feel free to ask us, pass on a question through the Q&A function. But I think a lot of people are watching on YouTube, so I might have to carry the baton for you, Mike, and maintain the interrogation. So let's talk about traffic congestion. Everybody has been making fun of Doug Ford and his plan to tunnel under the 401 as just a boondoggle again and pie in the sky underground. Your friends in the NDP have proposed an alternative solution, and I can't remember, so you'll tell me where the Green Party is on this. But let me just lay this out for you. So in the last election campaign, you'll recall the NDP proposed to remove tolls for trucks. And that always struck me as a bit odd because I remember a previous NDP leader named David Lewis, before you were born, who would always complain about what he called corporate welfare bumps that the government was supporting. And it seems to me that this proposal from the NDP would, by giving truckers a break, truckers work for trucking companies, would be a handout for companies on the government's dime, on the dime of taxpayers. This campaign, as you know, the NDP under Marit Stiles will remove tolls immediately for truckers, trucking companies, clear, and then within 100 days of taking power, if they do, maybe with your support, they would remove tolls for everybody on the 407. Is that a solution? Because I'm a bit old-fashioned, and I remember, well, we had Bob Ray on the Democracy Forum last week. He built the 407, and he's madder than anybody when he has to pay a toll, thanks to the Mike Harris Tories. But Bob Ray believes in tolls. He believes in price signals. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, well, I'll have to admit, Martin, that the paying the tolls for truckers on the 407 was first proposed by the Ontario Green Party, so you're going to have to blame me for that one. And here's
corporate welfare bump.
And here's why. It would cost $4 billion over 30 years to pay the tolls of truckers on the 407. We could immediately help to solve gridlock on the 401 by fully utilizing the 407. That would be far cheaper than the 10 to 12 or even more billion that we would have to spend to build Highway 413. So let's make more efficient and better use of our existing highway system before we even talk about building more highways, because we know that when we build more highways, it just creates more gridlock. And I'll give you a personal example I'm experiencing right now. So as you know, I have to drive my electric vehicle from Guelph into Queen's Park a lot. And about a year and a half or so ago, the widening of the 401 between Toronto and Milton was completed. And for the first 3 months, it was fantastic. No gridlock. Now it's pure gridlock again. So we're not going to solve this problem until we actually start investing in transit. We still don't have a
Let me jump in there. I agree with you on investing in transit, but let's just drill down. Let's have some fun here because you're here at a democracy forum, so let's try to drill down, not build a tunnel, but talk about the congestion you just mentioned. We all read in the papers that build more roads, you remove tolls, within a matter of weeks, months, in your case, 3 months, the congestion just fills the field. I think they call it demand induced. You can finish the sentence for me. Um, so, or supply induced congestion. You build it, they will drive in a matter of months. So if you remove tolls entirely for truckers and everybody, the 407 will be full in a minute. And there's, as Mr. Ray was arguing last week, if you have price signals, it reminds people that it's a limited and scarce resource. We learned that in Economics 101. I did. And so if you have that price signal, you can reduce congestion, actually. That's why the 407 isn't congested. It forces people to think twice. If you make it a free-for-all, look, I'm not going to lecture to you. You get the idea. I think you do. I think a lot of people do. So why remove tolls as a suggestion to congestion, as a solution to pollution, when in fact tolls are one device that a lot of environmentalists support as a way to reduce car use and reduce urban sprawl?
Yeah, well, that's why we're not advocating for removing all the tolls on the 407. We're just doing a targeted solution to move trucks off of the 401 to better utilize the 407. I disagree with the NDP on let's buy back the 407 because I don't think that's going to be affordable for us. And we're not talking about removing tolls on the 407. I don't know how the NDP is even going to make that happen, given the fact that it's a private highway. This is why I think we need to really start seriously having a conversation about, one, building more homes we can afford in the communities close to where people work, which is why we're saying let's legalize fourplexes and four-story as of right across the province. Let's legalize 6 to 11-story buildings along major transit and transportation corridors in large urban centers. Let's legalize sixplexes in cities over 500,000 people. So we start to be in a situation where people don't have these long, expensive commutes, and that they can take transit to work, they can walk to work, they can cycle to work, as long as the premier doesn't rip the bike lanes out to make it safe to cycle to work. That's how we can start building more affordable communities, and that's how we can actually start really reducing gridlock. I mean, one of the things that makes me frustrated, being the MPP for Guelph, is for over a decade, we've been promised all-day two-way GO service on the Toronto to Kitchener GO line. We still don't have that. We don't even have a timetable for that, Martin. There's also things we could do immediately right now, like having dedicated bus routes, GO bus routes for intercity connections. So if I want to get from Guelph to Hamilton, I got to go to Union Station in Toronto and then to Hamilton because I don't have a direct bus connection between Guelph and Hamilton. Is just one example. So there are a whole host of things we could be doing right now to expand transit capacity with our existing infrastructure to help reduce commute times, while we start building communities where people can actually live close to where they work, shop, and spend time with their families.
So you're leader of the Green Party. I raise a glass to you again, my green mug. Your job seems to be getting harder not because pollution and global warming are getting worse. That's a problem we're all facing, whether we realize it or not. The problem is a lot of people either don't realize it or just don't want to think about it or talk about it. So is global warming falling off the radar, or how do you talk about it in a provincial election? How do you keep a conversation going at the door? Do people ask you about it at the door because you're the green guy, and do they think of you as kind of a one issue politician, and then maybe that's why you're the list guy, because you always want to have that list ready. That's not one issue, it's 5 that we think about.
Yeah, so how I've been talking about climate in this election is talking about it as an affordability issue. And, right now, Doug Ford's in the pocket of the big oil and gas companies. And I'll give you one quick example of that. When the Independent Ontario Energy Board said, hey, let's stop subsidizing fossil gas hookups because heat pumps are cheaper for people anyway, within 12 hours, the Ford government said, oh no, we're going to introduce legislation to protect the profits of the big oil and gas companies. at your expense. So let's just stop subsidizing fossil gas hookups. And why not in Ontario? Let's do what PEI in New Brunswick has done, offer free heat pumps for people with incomes, household incomes under $100,000, because they're going to save money on their heating and cooling and reduce climate pollution at the same time. Why don't we make, Doug Ford, I like the fact that he wants to start building more electric vehicles in Ontario, but he doesn't want any of them to be sold in Ontario. It's hard to get an electric vehicle in Ontario because they're all going to Quebec and British Columbia because they actually have programs to help people afford electric vehicles. So let's bring the rebates back. So if you can make an electric vehicle affordable for somebody and a heat pump affordable for somebody, they can save between $500 and $777 a month. Let's help people save money and reduce climate pollution at the same time, but it's going to take a premier who's not in the pockets of the big oil and gas companies.
Okay. You've been leader since 2009, longer than anybody. You're a survivor. I don't see any knives coming out for you. Congratulations. Lots of love inside the party, outside the party. Makes you an oasis of stability, certainly compared to your federal cousins. So you and I have talked about this over the years. It's been hard to watch some of the infighting at the federal level. We had the formal federal Green leader, Annamie Paul, on the Democracy Forum a few years ago while she was still there. And then she left in a very difficult circumstance, and she accused the party of anti-Black racism, of anti-Semitism, and of not supporting her as the party's leader. Question is, does the federal, that's them, not you, but it's not a trick question, it's a serious question. Does that federal infighting, has there been spillover? Because we definitely see crossover between Ontario and federal politics for the other parties. When the NDP is down federally, it hurts Marit Stiles and the Ontario NDP. There's no question that there's interrelation between those polling numbers. Federal, again, for the Ontario Liberals, when Justin Trudeau was unpopular, that hurt Bonnie Crombie. So how does it affect you? What's the crossover effect?
Martin, I think I've been pretty effective in showing to people that the Ontario Greens have a different culture. We have a different constitution. We're separate parties. And because of that, while this turmoil is happening with the federal party, we've actually doubled our caucus. So it doesn't seem to be hurting us in that regard. Our fundraising numbers are at historic highs. Last year was the best fundraising year the party's ever had outside of an election. The first day of the election call this year is the best one-day fundraising day we've ever had during an election. So maybe
does it never come up?
You know what? You're the first person who's brought it up in this entire campaign, to be honest. It hasn't come up. Nobody talks about it at the door.
Good.
Yeah.
Great.
So I think we're weathering that storm. And I just want to say to my friend Annamie Paul, I don't know if anybody knocked on more doors for her than I did.
I remember that. The two of you worked well together, and I think it was hard for you to watch what happened to her. And so there's no plan to have this kind of weird co-leadership structure where it's two leaders and then it's on again, off again. It's Mike forever. You're leader for life.
No, it's not Mike forever. Let's be clear about that. But we have two fantastic deputy leaders, Ashlyn Clancy, our MPP here in Kitchener Centre, Matt Richter, who I'm hoping is going to be our next MPP from Parry Sound Muskoka. The three of us work well together as a leadership team, but we're very clear. I'm the leader.
Okay. I'm going to ask you, that was my only trick question. I do want to ask you a question that was submitted here. So this is not me. So I'm not going to be the first person to ask you this question. Okay. You were publicly courted to run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party 2 years ago, which speaks to your credibility and appeal beyond just Green voters. Given Ontario's current political landscape, do you see a future where the Green Party or you as a leader would collaborate more formally, not just cooperate, but more formally to strengthen the progressive movement in Ontario?
I think right now I'm, as you can imagine, very focused on February 27th and growing the Green Party in this election. I was honored to have, some very highly, folks I really respect in the Liberal Party asked me to run. I gave it serious consideration. And the feedback I heard from Green Party members in particular was that, Mike, you punch well above your weight as the Ontario Green leader. Like, we want you at Queen's Park. Your voice at Queen's Park makes a difference. And, Martin, I was just asked this particular question by another journalist. So this isn't the first time I've been asked in this election campaign. And this person was saying, how
I
come
didn't ask the
not by
question.
you?
One of our viewers asked the question.
And somebody asked me, they said, Mike, why didn't you do that? And at the end of the day, I feel like I can be most effective as the Ontario Green leader. I feel like we punch well above our weight. And what I do is not about Mike Schreiner. It's about how do we build a movement. And the Ontario Greens are building a movement. You know what? It may be growing slow, but it is growing and the momentum is gaining. And I'm really proud of the work I've been able to achieve at Queen's Park and the growth that we're seeing in the Ontario Green Party.
You're right that you were asked by a lot of influential liberals. Greg Sorbara, Deb Matthews signed the letter of endorsement for you. You wouldn't have been the first party leader to switch parties. We had Bob Rae on last week, as I said. He was a premier of Ontario for the NDP, and he later joined the Liberals and became their interim leader federally as well. But I don't think I've ever seen a leader take so much time thinking about it. You were playing footsie. You weren't playing footsie, but you had a foot in each camp. And as our premier caretaker, Premier Doug Ford, is fond of saying, you can't put your butt on both sides of the fence, quote unquote. You did for a little while, and then you got off the fence. What took you so long?
You know what? I told folks that I would give it serious consideration and I wanted to take the time to talk to people. And I traveled around the province, asked Green Party members what they thought the best way forward. And the answer was clear that I am most effective as the leader of the Ontario Green Party. And I'm proud of the work we're doing. I'm proud of the fact we've doubled our caucus and we're going to continue to have a strong Green voice at Queen's Park.
If you had jumped, just for fun, a thought experiment, maybe the Liberals would not have ended their love affair with the carbon levy. You saw the new leader, Bonnie Crombie, was the first Liberal out of the gate to say, no more carbon levy. You Democrats have also dropped the carbon levy. In British Columbia, they're off of it now, and Jagmeet Singh is not fond of it. I remember even when we used to talk about that carbon pricing, cap and trade were ideas that emanated from the right wing, and then the Liberals endorsed it and embraced it. Now, you used to always try to talk my head off about something different that you called the carbon dividend, if I recall correctly. I find it hard to keep track of how the different platforms iterate. What do you think of the rise and fall of the carbon levy politically, federally, cap and trade gone? And where are you on that now?
Yeah, no, you're right. Those are ideas that first came from the right side of the spectrum. And I think where the Ontario Greens have fallen down now is we have the technology to solve the climate crisis in a way that makes people's lives more affordable. And we need government now to make those solutions affordable for people. So that's why we're saying everybody, every household under $100,000, free electric and cooling heat pump for you. Those of you above, will provide you a zero interest loan to put it in. We're going to provide rebates for people to purchase not only new electric vehicles, but used electric vehicles and electric bikes, because that's the most affordable transportation option for you. So we can save you money if you move to electrified transportation. We are going to be working with industry to help decarbonize things like steelmaking with electric arc furnaces. So I think what the conservative side of the spectrum needs to recognize now is that we're going to need significant government intervention to help people, small businesses and larger businesses decarbonize. And we can do it in a way that saves them money, but it's going to take government investment to do that. And our costed platform will show us the path forward on how to do that. And we'll leave the federal liberals to defend their poorly designed tax program.
Okay, let me ask you a question here from our audience. Let's just see, here it is. Does the Green Party support nuclear power, especially as Ontario faces the prospect of creating new LNG power plants, liquefied natural gas power plants?
Yeah, so I've been very clear that the Ontario Greens recognize that Darlington and Bruce, our two largest nuclear plants, will be producing electricity in Ontario for decades to come. We're not going to close down 50% of Ontario's electricity generating capacity, especially after government has just spent billions of dollars rebuilding them. When we look,
You're laughing at the idea, but the Greens in Germany forced Germany to close down nuclear
oh,
plants.
yeah,
But you're the Ontario Green Party. You're different.
we're the Ontario Green Party. We're principled, progressive, pragmatic party. And so we're not going to shut Darlington and Bruce down. That wouldn't make sense for Ontario. But when we look at what is the lowest cost, cleanest way to meet our energy needs moving forward, first of all, conservation and energy efficiency. That's the lowest cost solution. Help people save money by saving energy. And secondly, I believe we should have a public competitive procurement process for the lowest cost emission-free electricity, because wind, solar, and storage now are the lowest cost solutions. That's why $600 billion was invested in wind, solar, and storage last year globally. That's where you're going to see Ontario, if we want to take the lowest cost path, ramp up our electricity supply. And then, of course, we're blessed in Ontario with a significant amount of water power. Obviously, Niagara Falls being, the largest source, but we still have a lot of run-of-river resources available for us, up to about additional 5,000 megawatts. So I think our grid, from a green perspective, would be a combination of existing nuclear power, wind, solar, storage, and water power, combined with smart conservation and energy efficiency programs.
I don't want to. I would never disagree with you publicly, but I'm not sure there's that much unharnessed hydropower left in Ontario. We're not Quebec, but I'll let that. I won't fact check you. I'll just raise. I'm going to arch an eyebrow.
Go talk to my friend Paul Norris at the Ontario Water Power Association.
I'm from Quebec. You're from Kansas. I love hydro, but I don't think there's that much left to harness here. But that said, here's a question: how? Yeah, because I like this question. I didn't write it, Mike, because it's about price signals again. How will you work with municipalities to advance climate conscious urban policies like congestion pricing or bike lanes?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the Ontario Greens will have in our platform dedicated infrastructure funding for safe cycling and walking infrastructure. There's this ridiculous idea that, we would waste $40 million ripping bike lanes out in the city of Toronto, or that we won't allow other municipalities to put in bike lanes, when we know that cycling is one of the most affordable transportation options for people, and it improves business for small businesses. We've seen that along Bloor Street, and we should be advancing that in communities across the province. And so, I would say, as we invest in, building more gentle density and missing middle housing, the need for cycling and walking infrastructure is going to become even more important.
Can I just have some fun here for a second? You like electric cars. I like bicycles. When I'm not taking TTC in the dead of winter, because I don't like salt on my bicycle, my beautiful, precious bicycle, I bike to work almost every day. You see me in the legislature, you look at me with a funny look as I come around with my bike clips and so on. But can you have too much of a good thing? I don't agree with, personally, I'm a columnist, I'm allowed to have opinions. I don't agree with Doug Ford bigfooting Toronto and ripping out the bike lanes necessarily. It's municipal jurisdiction. I believe in local accountability for those politicians. There's even a word for that, I think, in politics: subsidiarity. You let the local level, the lowest level, the government, the level of government that's closest to the people should decide these things. And Doug Ford is bigfooting them. But can you have, just for fun, can you have too much of a good thing? Can you not have, is it not possible to have too many bike lanes that aren't in the perfect place? You mentioned Bloor Street. At Bloor and Yonge, those bike lanes aren't much used in winter. On Yonge Street, which I use, those bike lanes are barely used in winter, and there's a lot of congestion. And you don't seem to like congestion. So how do you square that circle?
Yeah, well, Martin, as you know, I oftentimes drive my electric car to Queen's Park, so I've got to come from Guelph, not from in Toronto. And I can tell you, when I drive along Bloor or College, or I come up University or Yonge Street in my electric car, and I look at those bike lanes, I say, thank you, bike lanes. Because every cyclist I see going by, I'm thinking, can you imagine if that person was in a car and how much worse congestion would be? So I actually think it improves traffic flow. I think the
But
study.
my question wasn't about bike lanes, good or bad. Can they ever be in the wrong place?
Oh, I think so. I mean, that's a decision that local councilors, I would agree with, are best positioned to make that decision. I don't spend a lot of time like far Bloor West, like out in Etobicoke, where it seems like there's complaints, but I can tell you the Bloor Street bike lanes, let's say from Hyde Park into Queens Park, my experience personally and the data I've seen shows that it improves traffic flow and it's actually improved businesses for local businesses. So I would say, why is the premier ripping up those bike lanes when all the data shows they've been effective? So let's leave it up to municipalities to make those decisions because I think you're right. They're the ones who are best placed to make them.
And to make their own mistakes and clean up their own mess, if that's the case. I love that you have this phrasing now. Whenever you say your vehicle, it's always my electric car. It's like that they're all conjoined. It's always the electric cars. It's like there's like a hyphen between them, and never just my car. Uh, Fair enough, makes sense. Here's a question for you: does policy matter? I see Doug Ford winning the 2018 election without any policy other than buck a beer and beer in corner stores, which unfortunately he delivered on the latter promise, even if the former promise about buck a beer fizzled out. So does policy matter now, or is it all about personality and populism and affordability in terms of my pocketbook, as opposed to the collective interest and the national or provincial interest?
Yeah, well, I see this is somebody who got into politics as a policy wonk, that I've had to learn that policy doesn't matter as much as somebody like me would like it to matter. I think
Or me?
or you, yeah, you write a lot of policy heavy columns. I think policy still does matter, but I think the days of the red book platform being thrown around, that's not as relevant to voters today as maybe 20 years ago. And I think that's something politicians have to realize. But I think policy still does matter. I mean, the housing policy we've put forward, we've received such positive feedback to that because people are saying, finally, a party that's willing to put out some bold ideas to address the housing crisis. And I think that policy does matter and it does move the needle with some voters. But I think we live in a world now where, values and vibes probably matter more than policy for most voters.
Okay, interesting. Um, History shows that when voters are worried about the economy, they tend to gravitate to the right of center party. In America, in Canada, tends to hurt the NDP. I think they might have a hard challenge this time because of the economic uncertainty that is affecting people. How does economic uncertainty affect the Green vote?
Well, I think certainly when you have economic uncertainty, people are they deprioritize issues like addressing climate change. So I think it's incumbent upon me, and one of the reasons I'm so focused on how addressing climate can save you money is to talk to those economic anxieties that people have. One of the reasons I talk about the $2 trillion that were invested last year alone in the green transition is because we should be attracting those investment dollars to Ontario to create Ontario companies, Ontario jobs, Ontario prosperity. So I think it's incumbent upon me to make those issues relevant to people where they are right now.
I don't want to get too nostalgic with you, but when you talk about that shift in political awareness and commitment, there was this president you may have heard of, John F. Kennedy, who talked about, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. You don't hear that very much, not when US aid and foreign aid are being demolished and unraveled by the Trump administration. So, to just how much of politics is still transformational, or is it all now transactional?
Yeah, I don't think it's all transactional. I think politicians like Doug Ford want to make it transactional. I think politicians like Donald Trump want to make it transactional. But I can tell you, you can still get elected making it service oriented. And I've really made my whole campaign and my political career about public service. If I could put a commercial in for Rotary clubs, I'm a Rotarian, and the motto is service above
Ah,
self. And I can tell you, there are a number of Rotarians in Guelph who come up to me all the time and say, you know what, I'm a lifelong conservative voter. I vote for you, Mike, because I respect the fact that you put service to community front and center in the work you do. And I think one of the reasons Ontario Greens are really putting forward candidates as local champions in this campaign, and I've been saying to folks like, I'm not Ashland Clancy's boss in Kitchener Centre, the people of Kitchener Centre are. I'm not Matt Richter's boss in Parry Sound Muskoka, the people of Parry Sound Muskoka are. We're really asking our candidates to talk about how they're going to serve their communities, how they're going to be advocates for people in their riding at Queen's Park, not Mike Schreiner's voice in the riding. And I think there is a hunger for that kind of politics. I think it's less about policy and it's more about service.
Rotary Club, I didn't know that. Is that where you learned the speaking style?
No, I think I had that before I joined Rotary. I just joined Rotary because I want to serve my community. And I think not just Rotary. I mean, you have lots of other service clubs as well. Maybe that's a little old-fashioned in me, being a farm kid, but I think service clubs make such a valuable contribution to our communities. And so that's work I want to do, before politics, during politics, and after politics.
No, I wasn't making fun. I think they're great, and they also make people into persuasive speakers, which possibly you are. We had another persuasive speaker, as I keep mentioning, the other day. He's top of mind, Bob Ray, and he talked about how in the conundrum of the contradiction of democracy that we're all wrestling with after the last American election, which was, by all accounts, a free and fair election. It wasn't a rigged election, the last one. Neither was the one before, but let's not go too far back. And Mr. Ray reminded us that in a democracy, the majority of people aren't always of a generous frame of mind or always enlightened about the most compelling issues. And particularly, he talked at great length about climate change. And we joked that you were coming on this week and that he had preempted you, because he talked about the locomotive coming at us under that tunnel under the 401, that is climate change, and how hard it is to get people to focus on long-term issues when they're concerned about short-term gain. So I'm sorry for coming back at you on that question, but you must struggle with that.
Yeah, one of the ways to think about it, though, is so think about building this tunnel under the 401, and then think about the floods that hit the GTA last summer. That flood event cost $1.3 billion an hour. Think of the people's basements who are wiped out. Think of how some people's lives were threatened if you're driving along the lakeshore when the waves hit. Think of the forest fires the year before. That cost our healthcare system an additional $1.3 billion in 4 days due to increased hospitalization for people with respiratory issues. And so I think my job is to say, we can help prevent those kinds of costly catastrophes from happening, and we can help you save money at the same time if we implement the solutions to climate in a smart, effective way. And so I think there is a way to talk about climate that connects directly with people's day-to-day affordability concerns. This is why housing is so important to me. Once again, low-density sprawl is incredibly expensive, incredibly destructive, and is the largest driver of climate pollution in Ontario. So why don't we just build homes that people can afford so they don't have these long commutes, and that'll save them money and make their lives better. So I think we just have to talk about how we address these issues in ways that relate to people's day-to-day lives.
Doug Ford promised to get it done in the last election, and he won on a promise to build 1.5 million homes in a decade. Now, he got a bit ahead of his skis. He's way behind on that target, on that stretch goal. He got himself in trouble on the Greenbelt, I would argue, because he was trying to cut corners and get things done. He was panicking and he wanted to, Greenbelt, here's a whole parcel of land where I can build some more sprawl. There's a police investigation. The auditor went at him for $8 billion of profits that would have gone to developers. Why were Ontarians, he said he was sorry, why were Ontarians so willing to forgive and forget, and he's right back up high in the polls?
Yeah, so why Ontarians are willing to forgive and forget, I don't know. I think on housing, both the federal conservative leader and the provincial government has pointed the finger at the federal government and the prime minister. But I have to remind people, housing is provincial jurisdiction. Ontario has the worst housing starts in the entire country. the highest housing prices in the entire country. This is Doug Ford's jurisdiction. And one of the things I've been saying in this campaign is we're fighting for fairness for people. And the fairness is having a premier who is going to build homes that you can afford versus a premier who's unlocking land so that wealthy, well-connected land speculators can cash in at your expense. We will not solve the housing crisis if Doug Ford's going to put the profits of land speculators over the affordability concerns of the people of Ontario. I'm going to continue to keep pushing that message over the next 16 days, and we'll see how people respond.
Quick question. You can't come to a TMU Democracy Forum without us asking you about funding for post-secondary education. The Premier, right after taking power in 2018, within a year, decided to cut tuition by 10%. Classic populism out of the populism playbook. Then he froze that 10% reduction, and tuition has been frozen ever since. Now, I asked the other major party leaders last week, would you unfreeze tuition as a blue ribbon panel recommended so that universities and colleges can restore some of that cash flow? And they said, no, got to keep tuition frozen. That's politics. What would you do?
I would increase base funding for our universities and colleges. You'll see that in our costed platform. The challenge Ontario is facing, just like in healthcare, we have the lowest per capita funding of any jurisdiction in the country. Post-secondary education, we have the lowest per capita funding of any province in the country. It would take a $5 billion investment just to get us to the national average. The Ontario Greens are committed to putting us on the pathway to getting to that national average. I know it's not the most exciting conversation in the election campaign, but I want to say to folks, post-secondary education, you're seeing programs cut in colleges now. The Ford government talks a lot about the importance of the trades. Trades programs are being cut at colleges right now. You're seeing students struggling to get into certain programs in Ontario universities now because they simply don't have the money to admit any additional students. You're going to start seeing more cuts to programs at universities and colleges moving forward if we don't make an investment in our post-secondary education. These are your kids. This is our future. This is our workforce. I've been telling businesses, these are the folks who produce the research that you commercialize and turn into technology that builds prosperity in our country. So I don't think now is the time to be talking about tuition increases, but now is the time to be talking about a commitment to investing more in post-secondary education. And it's one of the reasons I was the only MPP to vote against the whole license sticker gimmick in the last provincial election. That's cost us like over $2 billion in the first year, $1.5 billion every year after that. It's one of the reasons I'm against these $200 checks that are going to millionaires and billionaires at a cost of $3.2 billion. Like, we should stop wasting money on these kind of populist gimmicks and actually invest it in the things that matter to people, post-secondary education being one of them.
So you're not always reflexively a populist. Good for you. Quick question: would you make the universities and colleges whole for the funding that they lost, the cash flow they lost by cutting and then freezing tuition in a high inflation environment?
We did that in our last platform, and we'll be doing that again this time.
Would you make it a condition of supporting a government? No, you don't have to answer that. I'll let you think about that one. Just giving you an idea there. Two quick questions in the time we have left. Work from home, this is a trick question, but not for me. No, it's a serious question. Work from home allows people to reduce the pollution from not commuting. Will you allow Ontario public servants to work remotely and relax the return to work mandate? This is a tough question. We had a few labor leaders, Lana Payne from Unifor and the leader of the CLC, Canadian Labour Congress, asked this question, and it's a tough question.
It is a real tough question. So I think we should allow every worker, including public sector workers, who can effectively work from home to work from home. I think it's important to still have places for people to go into the office and interact with colleagues. So I think 100% work from home isn't conducive to building workplace relationships and trust. But day-to-day work, Ontario Greens, before the pandemic even said, we should be creating more opportunities for people to work from home when they can work from home, because one, it's an affordability issue. They don't have to commute. And two, it's an environmental issue because less pollution from commuting. And three, it's a great way to help address gridlock.
It is a tough issue, and you're kind of on both sides of it. But on the one hand, that's how you and I interact at the legislature. On the other hand, that's why we let you do this Zoom event remotely, so that you wouldn't have to use that electric car to come into Toronto. Okay, one real quick question. We're going to go into a tiny bit of overtime for a minute or two, because I know this is a question you cannot resist answering. It's not from me, it's from our audience. What are the kinds of talents the Greens are looking for in candidates to run in elections? What a beauty.
Yeah. That is a beauty. Can I just say one thing about you teasing me about my electric vehicle? One of the reasons I keep talking about it is I want to prove to people that you can tour the province of Ontario in minus 25-degree winter weather in an electric vehicle. So let's just break through the myths that you can't do that. What we're looking
And the Toronto Star actually sent out a reporter in a Tesla. It was before Elon Musk
Yes, I saw that. That was a great series.
Yeah, and he went all across Northern Ontario as well. So what are you looking for in candidates?
So I'm looking for candidates who have the energy and the desire to serve their community and who really want to put the work in to get elected and to be their community's advocate at Queen's Park. I think I'll be honest with all of you. It is a lot harder to get elected as a Green than running for the Conservative, Liberal, and NDP. Let's just be honest. Where Greens have gotten elected is because we've worked incredibly hard. So if you have the energy, the passion, and the vision, and the work ethic to put the work in, the great thing about being a Green MPP is I don't tell you what to say and do. I mean, obviously we have to share values together, but even Ashland Clancy and I haven't voted 100% of the time together. And you have a bit of freedom. I don't give you talking points and tell you you have to say this. I'll help you with that, but I'm not going to command it. So you have the freedom to actually bring forward your authentic self. And I think that's one of the things that helps me stand out at Queen's Park and other Greens is you get an authentic, honest politician. And even if you don't always agree with me, you at least know where I'm coming from.
There is only one talking point that you require from all Greens, and they have to say electric car in the same sentence. Right?
No,
My electric car.
I have a few candidates ask me, I don't own an electric car. Can I run for the Greens? And I'm, yes, of course. We're going to help you afford an electric car, but you don't have to have one.
Okay. All right. That's all the time we have for questions. Remember, Election Day is on February 27th, just 16 days away, because like a vote is a terrible thing to waste. So please find a way to vote. I want to thank our guest, the Ontario Green Party leader, Mike Schreiner. Safe travels on the campaign trail, Mike. Thanks also to everyone in the audience for being so democratic. A reminder that next month we will be having the deputy leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Melissa Lantsman. So stay tuned for details. Thanks to everyone from the Deus team for making the Democracy Forum possible at TMU, especially the executive director, Kareem Bardisi, and a special shout out to Catherine Embergi for making all of this possible. Merci, Megwich, thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, TMU.